May 19th, 1780. Somewhere in Connecticut, a farmer steps outside at noon and looks up. The sky is black, not overcast, not stormy. Black, he goes back inside, lights a candle, sits down, and waits for an explanation that never comes. That explanation still hasn't come, because what happened on that day, what darkened the skies from New England to eastern Canada, what turned the midday sun into a blood-red ember, what sent livestock back to their barns and drove men to their knees in prayer, has never been satisfactorily explained. And I don't think it was meant to be, because when you trace what came before that dark sky and what came after, you don't find forest fires. You find the final hours of a civilization. Let's establish what we actually know, what is documented, what no one disputes. May 19th, 1780. The darkness descended on New England and parts of eastern Canada around mid-morning. By noon it was total. Candles were lit in homes, in taverns, in legislative chambers. The Connecticut General Assembly, in the middle of active session, merely adjourned because members could not see each other across the room. One member, Colonel Abraham Davenport, reportedly stood up and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Either the day of judgment has come, or it has not. If it has, I wish to be found doing my duty." That quote has been remembered for 240 years, but the event itself has been quietly buried. The official explanation, the one written into textbooks, the one offered on Wikipedia, the one stated with complete confidence whenever this subject is raised, is forest fires. Burning woodlands in the interior of the continent, carried by unusual atmospheric conditions sufficient to block sunlight across a wide region. And for most people, that closes the case. But here's what that explanation can't account for. First, the speed. Witnesses don't describe smoke gradually gathering, clouds thickening, a slow dimming. They describe a wall, a curtain being drawn. Timothy Dwight, a man who would later become president of Yale and who personally documented the event, wrote that the darkness was as uncommon in its appearance as in its depth. That is not how wildfire smoke behaves. I've stood under wildfire smoke. It seeps in, it filters, it turns the sun orange, then brown, then hides it behind a haze. It does not arrive like a curtain. Second, the colour. Multiple independent witnesses from different locations describe a reddish, copper-tinted quality to the air where the darkness met remaining light. The moon, when it finally rose that night, was described as the colour of blood. Not haze orange, blood red, deep, saturated, wrong. Third, the scale. Harvard professor Samuel Williams, one of the most rigorous scientific minds of the era, documented the event with unusual care. He estimated the affected area at over 150,000 square miles. That is not a wildfire footprint. That is a continental scale atmospheric event. And fourth, the one that doesn't get discussed at all, the silence afterward, an event that terrified an entire region of a young nation, that sent people into churches, that shut down a legislative session, that killed animals with confusion and fear, and within weeks the explanation is filed away. Forest fires, unusual wind, nothing more. No investigation, no continued inquiry, no scientific expedition to find the source. Just closure. Why close a case that hadn't been opened? I want you to find an old map, not a modern one. Go find a European map from 1700, from 1720. Look at the landmass stretching across Central and Northern Asia. You'll see a word, Tartaria, or Tartary, or Grand Tartary, depending on the source, the language, the publisher. But it's there, on Dutch maps, on French maps, British maps, Russian maps, Portuguese maps. It is there across centuries of cartographic tradition, a name given to vast territories stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific, a name used by Marco Polo, a name used by explorers, traders, missionaries, diplomats, a name that appears on maps for 400 years. Now find a map from 1820. It's gone. Not revised, not subdivided with explanatory notes, not transitioned into more specific regional designations with reference to its previous name. Gone. Replaced cleanly with the territories of the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty, various khanates and administrative regions, as if Tartaria had never been a designation at all. The official explanation for this is that Tartaria was always just a vague geographic term, a catch-all used by European mapmakers who didn't have detailed knowledge of the interior of Asia. As exploration increased and cartographic precision improved, the vague term gave way to more accurate designations. That explanation sounds reasonable until you apply it seriously, because 18th century mapmakers were not sloppy, they were meticulous, they documented their sources. They noted their corrections. When a name changed on a map, there were notes in the margins, correspondence between publishers, debate in geographic societies. The cartographic record of this era is actually extremely rich in documentation of its own evolution. Except for Tartaria. For Tartaria, there's nothing. No cartographic debate about what to call it instead. No explanation of why a 400-year designation was being abandoned. No transitional map showing the phasing out period. The name simply stops appearing across multiple countries, across multiple publishing traditions, within a window of roughly 30 to 40 years. That window begins around 1780. The same year the sky went black. Now I want to talk about buildings. Specifically, I want to talk about a very strange problem that official history has never adequately explained. In the decades following 1780, roughly 1790 to 1880, massive, technologically sophisticated, architecturally unified structures appear across the world. Not just in Europe, not just in the established centers of civilization, everywhere. San Francisco, a rough settlement scrambling out of the gold rush chaos, suddenly has palatial Beaux-Arts civic buildings with colonnades and coffered ceilings and stonework that would challenge a modern construction crew. Melbourne, a colonial outpost incorporated in 1835, builds exhibition halls within decades that rival the great cathedrals of Europe in scale and sophistication. Chicago erects an entire exposition city, the White City of the 1893 World's Fair, in under 2 years. Hundreds of buildings, neoclassical facades, ornate interiors, infrastructure for 27 million visitors, built with 19th century tools in a Midwestern swamp on a timeline that professional architects today describe as essentially impossible. And this is not unique to America. St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, Bombay, Cairo, Sydney. Cities across the world that are supposedly being built from scratch during this period are filled with structures that reflect the same architectural vocabulary, the same proportions, the same details, the same relationship between ornamentation and structural function. We call it the neoclassical revival, a return to Greek and Roman ideals, spreading from Europe outward through colonial and cultural influence. But here's what that explanation requires you to believe. It requires you to believe that multiple cultures, in multiple countries, with varying levels of communication and trade connection, all simultaneously decided to build in the same style, using the same techniques, to the same standards. And all managed to execute that decision with a speed and precision that their documented technology cannot account for. It requires you to believe that the construction records were simply not kept, that the photographs just happened to mostly show completed buildings, that the supply chains for millions of tons of precision-cut stone were simply not documented, that the labour forces, which would have numbered in the tens of thousands for many of these projects, left no adequate record of their wages, their names, their organising structures. History keeps records of everything. We have payroll documents from Egyptian pyramid construction, we have labour contracts from medieval cathedral building, we have supply manifests from Roman infrastructure projects. But for the greatest construction boom in human history, the building of modern civilization itself, we have dedication plaques and official histories written decades after the fact, unless they weren't built, unless they were found. What if the neoclassical revival wasn't a revival at all? What if it was an inheritance? What if these buildings were already standing, already complete, already integrated with urban infrastructure, and the official histories were written afterward to explain why a new civilization was living inside architecture it hadn't built? Empty cities don't stay empty, but whoever moves in has a choice. Explain where the buildings came from or claim them. Let me lay this out plainly. Before 1780, a civilization exists. Vast, organized, technically sophisticated. appearing on every major map as Tartaria, possessing architecture unified enough in style to explain the global buildings we now attribute to the neoclassical revival, extensive enough to have maintained infrastructure across multiple continents, coherent enough that European mapmakers from a dozen different countries all recognize it by the same name for 400 years. 1780 to 1785, collapse, not gradual, not through slow conquest or cultural absorption, catastrophically and rapidly. The sky goes dark. Atmospheric disturbances cluster across this exact 5-year window. The dark day in 1780, the Laki eruption in 1783, creating its so-called dry fog across Europe. The Great Frost of 1783 to 1784, widespread crop failures in 1784 and 1785. Official history explains each of these separately. What if they're one signal, 1785 to 1820, the inheritance period? Surviving populations or arriving ones. Russian expansion eastward, European colonialism southward, American expansion westward, Chinese territorial consolidation northward, move into existing structures. Foundation myths are created. Dedication ceremonies are held for buildings already standing. Maps are redrawn. The word Tartaria begins its systematic disappearance. 1820 to 1900, historical revision. Encyclopedias are written or rewritten. Academic consensus forms around the new narrative. The architectural inheritance becomes evidence of industrial progress. Tartaria becomes a footnote, a mere geographic term, never a real civilization. The questions stop being asked because the answers are already installed. 1900 to present, the narrative solidifies. It becomes self-referential. Academic institutions cite each other. The consensus becomes invisible, not enforced, just assumed. And anyone who asks why the construction records don't exist, why the maps change so abruptly, why the buildings look the same from Chicago to Calcutta, is treated not as a serious historian, but as a conspiracy theorist. That's not an argument, that's a social mechanism for ending inquiry. Here is what haunts me most about this. If Tartaria was a real civilization, not a geographic catch-all, but an actual cultural and political entity, where did the people go? This isn't a small question. To build the architecture we're talking about, you need a population. Engineers, craftsmen, administrators, supply chains. Agricultural systems to feed the workers, trade systems to move materials, educational systems to transmit the technical knowledge. A civilization capable of building the classical architecture we're inheriting was a civilization of millions of people. Where did they go? Not gradually, not through slow assimilation over centuries. If the timeline I'm describing is correct, they disappear within a generation. Maps from 1770 show Tartaria as a dominant designation across Central Asia and beyond. Maps from 1820 show Russian territory, Chinese territory, British colonial territory. There is no war in the historical record that accounts for the military defeat of a civilization this size. No documentation of the campaigns, the battles, the surrenders, the treaties, no records of refugees flooding into neighbouring regions, no contemporary accounts of mass displacement on a continental scale. Just replacement. And here's what makes the silence even stranger. After the transition, no one investigated what came before. The new powers that inherited these territories showed no archaeological interest in the previous inhabitants. No one funded expeditions to understand who had built what. No linguistic scholars were sent to document surviving languages. No genealogists traced population continuity. Competing empires, Russian, British, French, American, Chinese, all separately independently, arrived at the same conclusion. Tartaria was never important enough to study. Think about that. 5 competing global empires with conflicting interests in virtually every domain of politics, trade, and territorial expansion, all agreeing that this particular question didn't need to be asked. That is not coincidence. That is consensus, and consensus that serves everyone equally tends to be consensus that was decided, not discovered. Let me bring you back to May 19th, 1780. One more time. With everything we've just discussed, the sky goes black. The official explanation is forest fires. And yes, there was atmospheric disturbance. That part isn't disputed. But the nature of that disturbance is, what does the atmospheric signature of a civilization's destruction look like? Consider what you would see from space, or from across a continent, if cities were burning, not one city, not a region, but an entire civilization's worth of infrastructure, simultaneously or in rapid succession. Stone buildings don't burn easily, but the cities around them do. Wood, fabric, food stores, fuel, the organic material of human life. Now add to that whatever technology this civilization possessed. We assume they were primitive because the official timeline requires them to be primitive. But the buildings suggest otherwise. The coordination suggests otherwise. The abruptness of their disappearance suggests otherwise. What if the catastrophe of 1780 to 1785 wasn't purely natural? What if the atmospheric disruption that produced the dark day, the dry fog of 1783, the crop failures of 1784, what if that disruption was partially human in origin? Not human in the way we understand human destruction in 1780, but human in the way we might understand it if this civilization was further advanced than we've been led to believe. The atmospheric signature of mass urban destruction would be continental in scale. It would produce darkness. It would produce red-tinged skies. It would produce prolonged particulate matter in the upper atmosphere. Exactly the kind that explains not just one dark day, but a 5-year cluster of atmospheric anomalies. Forest fires explain one afternoon in New England. They don't explain 1780 to 1785. Nothing in the official record does. I can't prove this. I want to be honest with you about that. The evidence is fragmented. It's been buried under 200 years of consensus. Official history has an answer for every anomaly I've described. And those answers are carefully designed to be individually plausible, even when they collectively require you to believe in coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. But I can ask questions. Why did Tartaria disappear from maps within a single generation, with no cartographic debate, no transitional documentation, no explanation? Where did the population go, the millions of people required to build and maintain the civilization those maps represent? Why do buildings from San Francisco to St. Petersburg share not just a style but a specific architectural vocabulary, details, proportions, construction techniques that supposedly emerge simultaneously across cultures with no connection? Why are there almost no construction photographs, no labor records, no supply chain documentation for the greatest building boom in history? Why did 5 competing global empires simultaneously agree that Tartaria wasn't worth studying? And why, on a day that terrified an entire region, that shut down a legislative session, that sent people to their knees, why was the investigation so swift, so conclusive, and so final? The dark day happened. That's in the record. Tartaria was on the maps. That's in the record. The buildings are still standing. You can walk through them today. What's not in the record is the connection, the why, the how, the what happened in between. And maybe that gap is natural, the incomplete record of a chaotic transitional period in human history. Or maybe the gap is intentional. Maybe we are living in inherited cities, walking through buildings we didn't build, reading histories written to close questions that should have stayed open. The sky went black on May 19, 1780, and when it cleared, we were told it was always ours. I'm not done asking why. If you've seen these buildings in your city, the ones with the columns and the domes and the impossible detail, leave a comment. Tell me what city. Tell me what building. Tell me what felt wrong about the official story, because the architecture is still there, still standing, still waiting. And stone doesn't lie.